All right, everyone. We've given it about 5 extra minutes. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'm going to do a quick introduction for myself. If you can turn on your cameras, if you're in a position to do that and want to do that, I'd love to see a little bit of your faces, and you all get to see mine. So that's a little bit fair. We'll try not to be very long. At least turn it on at the beginning so we can all see you, and then you can turn off after just the first couple of minutes here. So I'm going to do really quick introduction for myself to get us started. I'm going to ask you guys to do like 30 seconds each, and I'll call your name so you can kind of give us. I'll try and keep mine to the same limit, and then I'm going to do a little bit of background on how we got to this meeting. But I'll start with my short 30-second introduction, and then we'll hand it off to you guys. So I know some of you or some of us have met before, but others have not. My name is Justin Williams. I've been part of developing and building the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Tucson for Tucson, Arizona for the last 10 years, and probably innovation ecosystem building for another 5 or 6 before that, and was part of putting together the COVID online startup weekend, which kind of got me interested in the journey we're hopefully going to be beginning here going forward. So let me call out some names from my top left. Who's got their camera on? Debbie.
Hi, I'm Debbie Irwin. I'm with the Shenandoah Community Capital Fund in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. We are new to the Techstars world, but I'm on the SWAGO advisory board with Stephen Rodriguez, which is how we got involved in this. And we have a startup weekend coming up tomorrow. So I am deep in prep.
Exciting. All right. And Jay, you're next.
All right. Hey, Jay Cooper. For those of you who don't know me, I'm based out of Iowa City, Iowa. Entrepreneurial ecosystem builder. Been a startup weekend organizer since 2018, facilitator since 2020. So we have startup weekend Iowa City coming up in July. We have one an in-person one every July, and then a statewide online startup weekend every January. So glad to be here.
Kevin, you're next. Oh, Kevin's not muted, but muted. You want to tinker for a minute, and we'll go to Cecilia, and then we'll come back to you, Kevin.
Thanks. Cecilia Wessinger. I know a lot of people here from my time during the eShip initiatives around the Kauffman Foundation. I'm currently the Director for Global Community for the Global Entrepreneurship Network.
Hey. Hassan, you're next on my around the horn here.
Hello, everyone. Hassan Bazi. I'm an ecosystem builder based out of Detroit. I've participated in Startup Weekend here in Detroit in the past, and currently serve as Director of Community Innovation at Forward Cities.
Thanks, Hassan. I'm going to read from the chat. CJ Cornell, who's here in Arizona, he says he's not in a position to turn on his video or audio. So he's just listening, but he's a former ASU professor of entrepreneurship and part of the Kauffman eShip Builders working group, and former Global Entrepreneurship Week lead in Arizona in 2020. All right, and so next, Patricia.
Hi there, I'm Patricia Beckman. I was also part of the Kauffman eShip perspective and a number of the conferences. My background in life sciences, and I've worked in a venture-backed accelerator here in Seattle and started some translational research institutes to do mentoring, and also was a Kauffman Fellow in venture capital. I worked in Arizona in the past, setting up the sort of the AZ Bio Peers project and a variety of things for life science entrepreneurs down there. But I don't do that anymore. I'm in the Seattle area.
Well, we are sad to see you go, but Seattle's probably happy to have you.
They are.
Lee, can you go next?
Sure, I'm Lee Lester. I'm a part of the eShip family as well here in Long Beach, California. And I am also the founder and executive director of Ubuntu Institute of Learning, which is a training organization. And we just launched Launch Long Beach, which is an entrepreneurial program for entrepreneurs in underinvested communities, providing finance and education and mentorship and all the things, right? So just midway through our first cohort. So I'm excited to be a part of this. Thank you.
Exciting, welcome. Grace, you're next.
Hi, I'm Grace Rodriguez, Executive Director of Impact Hub Houston, and we were part of the Kauffman eShip program as a national resource provider. I do a lot of ecosystem development around sustainability and DEI.
Great. I realize that I have yet to come back to Kevin. How's your tech going?
I think I'm here. Am I here?
You are. Okay, you got your phone going.
Kevin Randolph, Vancouver, Washington. I was part of the startup of the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator and helped found the Network for Global Innovation, where we've been doing ecosystems around the world.
Great. And you're also the person I was asking about in the 415 area code. So,
Well, I've had a cellular phone since they were invented. So.
Mystery solved. Thank you. Russell, you're up next.
Right. I'm Russell Brand. I'm one of the local leaders for the Founder Institute chapter in Silicon Valley. And I'm a mentor for English-speaking chapters all over the world. In a former life, I started a couple of software companies, but now I spend my time mentoring new startups.
Great. Welcome, Russell. Chris, I think, is one of your colleagues who was in our meeting last week. So
Chris Fultz is my business partner. Yes.
Okay. Mary, you're up next.
Hey guys, I'm Mary Overby. I am located in Springfield, Missouri. I am a small business owner. I do micro lending and ecosystem building. I've been doing this for about 10 years, and I work with 4 different SCORE chapters across the Midwest. Work with SBDCs. I was part of the eShip way back in the day. Way back. Cecilia's like, she was the pain in the butt. Remember her? Very happy to see this come out tonight. I'm still invested, Cecilia. I haven't gone away. So
Excellent, Mary. Thank you. Grace. We have a photo. Do we have a there?
I already went.
Oh, you already went. Sorry. It's re-rotating all my pictures, so my system's failing. Yahya, did I say that right?
Oh, it's Yahya.
Yahya.
Yeah, you can call me John. It's fine. It actually means John, so it's actually John.
John. All right.
Yeah. So right now I'm somewhat of a researcher exploring how entrepreneurial ecosystems could create social and economic links to economic exchange, creating jobs and opportunity for people who are, marginalized or disenfranchised or just cut out of the economy. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
What a challenge and exciting work, I'm sure.
Yes.
Patricia, I think you're the last one for the moment.
Yeah, I already talked. Oh, another Patricia.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, when you turn off your cameras, then I lose track. All right. Did I miss anybody? I think I got it.
I'll turn back off.
There's 2 Patricia, so the other Patricia needs to go still.
Oh, Patricia. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, there's actually 2 Patricia. Oh, there. I'm sorry, multitasking here. I'm actually in Canada, and but I've been supporting like different initiative in the States, supporting entrepreneurs and yeah, no, I don't know. I kind of in and out. So yeah, I'm not there completely. So I apologize, but that's a brief resume. I'm excited about this. Recently I've been supporting, there's this initiative. She's based in New Jersey City. It's focusing on women in entrepreneurship. It's called Startup Women. And yeah, that's Hello, everyone.
Well, welcome. So thank you for everybody for joining. I'll start by saying that we did this same kind of a meeting last week on Friday. So you may have gotten 2 invites. I also added some new invitations between the 2 meetings. So this may be your first. But I wanted to just give a little bit of context that we had started this conversation. And my intention is that this is not a follow-on to the meeting, so you're not missing anything if you missed last week, but really a second offering of the same kind of conversation at a different time on people's calendars. And we'll probably do this a couple more times. And so let me back up a little bit and give a little bit more context. So, and then I'm gonna share my screen here. Let's see. All right. So between last week and this week, I put together a very poor presentation to kind of guide this a little bit better. And I'm going to try and maybe comment a little bit based on some of the ideas we heard last week that led to either a little bit of confusion as we moved through the conversation. People started to get a little bit of the idea. And by the end, it seemed like everybody not only got it, but was fairly enthusiastic about what we're doing. So, the context of this is building an online startup ecosystem. The specifics of it are Startup Weekend as an online event, a national online event that's upcoming. And to just start with those 2 ideas, I think it was a little bit unclear at the beginning of last week's meeting. Are we doing one or are we doing the other? And my point is that the bigger idea is that we're building an online startup ecosystem, or we're talking about it, and the idea is that we have the opportunity to run a national online startup weekend event. And that my experience in Tucson, it was the first event that I did in Tucson that helped me move forward into building and growing an ecosystem for entrepreneurship in Tucson. My background is that I did go to a couple of the eShip summits, the first 2, and developed an ecosystem support organization called Startup Tucson, which catalyzed a whole bunch of activity and identity and community and connections, and kind of created an overall regional sense that there was such a thing as an ecosystem, kind of introduced those terms and that work into the economic development leadership, and put together a framework that we applied in our community, I think, pretty successfully. And so I tell that story to say that the catalyst for the outcome of building a Tucson startup ecosystem was running a Startup Weekend Tucson. That experience helped me begin to work on the activities, and then the vision of that I developed as I moved through organizing the first event, and then decided to do more and see, kind of think from a systems perspective, what was missing, what were the gaps, how would we add activities and initiatives, and start thinking about metrics and outcomes. That the catalyst for it was doing a startup weekend. And so, so hopefully we're starting out with a little bit more clarity around the connection between the 2. But I know that took a little while to work through in the first meeting. So I want to pause before we go any further and just ask if there are any questions around the notion of the fact that a longer medium-term goal is to use a startup weekend event to do more work and activities leading up to it and beyond it that will help to build the online startup ecosystem. Any questions or anyone want to comment on that before we or ask for clarification before we get going any further? Because that's definitely, I think, an important idea to understand before we go on.
Just a quick clarifying thing for me. How is this dovetailing in with all of the other national work that's happening, whether it be with Global Entrepreneurship Week, National Entrepreneurship Week, all of those other organizations that are doing this nationwide convening of the builders?
I would say that is
least I'm on
part of the
mute.
conversation that we need to make sure
Oh, great.
we aren't,
Perfect.
we're doing
Perfect.
our part of it, whatever
It's
unique
spread a little thin.
additions
Yeah.
we can do without.
I think it's enough. We just wanted to put something underneath it that it would.
There we go. Hey, I got power tools. So I would say that it's an important question. It's the right question. I don't know that I have a comprehensive answer in terms of part of what I want to gain from this, not just these meetings, but the journey going this direction, is that we are learning more about those initiatives and identifying the gaps and the opportunities for collaboration. I mean, it's a very my sense is that that the biggest difference is that this is an online community in a sense, as opposed to so I think of Startup Champions Network as and its intention is to do advanced professional development for the ecosystem. Cecilia can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense of the Global Entrepreneurship Week and the USA version of it is that it's a week experience, but that it's lightly online. It's purposefully in person in the community. And I would say that in the same way that your question is about from the perspective of other and focus on the word national, I would also say what's our conversation over the last couple of years has been, how do you do this in a way that supplements the in-person Startup Weekend experience? And how do you, if this is going to be interesting, it needs to be done with a recognition that the marketplace of online people and the value proposition of doing an online Startup Weekend will lead to certain kinds of communities being built and serving certain kinds of needs. And so we should be flexible enough to come in with that sort of strategic thinking, but also to be humble enough to say, we don't have all the answers coming in. Does that fit with, and so therefore there's going to be a lot of opportunities to call out where we should be connecting and partnering, I would say. And that's one of the primary goals of a meeting like this, is that everybody in this meeting collectively has 1,000 times more knowledge than any one of us. So as an organizer, I want to be really open to that, really open. And then I would say that trying to identify what is it that we can do that others cannot because of their mission and their objectives. How do we do something special, in our own lane? So hopefully that's helpful. If not, or if anybody else has any other follow-ons, let's throw that out.
Can I clarify? So then Startup Tucson was strictly an online initiative?
No, we started in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very much a local Tucson in-person approach. The online dimension of this is very much since COVID and is an independent experience.
So so I'd like to get the timeline. So you guys have been doing Startup Tucson since 2011, then you did the eShip Summit stuff. And then since COVID, you've taken the startup online initiative, or the startup initiative, and moved it online. And so then you're bringing in other communities. What is the?
Let me be a little bit more expansive. You just kind of connect the dots of my personal professional experience. Startup Tucson is an entirely different entity. It's actually led by somebody else entirely at this moment. I'm gonna, in the next set of slides, I'll jump into a little bit of the journey to where we are today, which is sort of the next step. So anybody else have any clarifying. All right, excellent. Let's go back to. All right, so just to highlight the event that the date for the online startup weekend is May 27th through 29th. And I put a note here, it's full week. I'll go into some details about what that means. Let's see. So very first slide, talking a little for Mary, this is where kind of my professional journey had been very focused on Tucson and the work I was doing locally in my own community. When COVID hit, I happened to be one of maybe 40 or 50 USA-based startup weekend organizers that Techstars had, and Steven Rodriguez, who Debbie mentioned earlier, he was the lead, I think US and Latin America or US and Canada staff member responsible for community programs, including Startup Weekend. And so he was the lead outreach to people like me who were had been doing a lot of Startup Weekends in their local community. When COVID hit, obviously, during the lockdown, everything went crazy. We all kind of scrambled. Techstars was scrambling. They decided to launch in a matter of a week or so. They began launching all over the world online Startup Weekends for the first time, and they were basically assigning out to each country one combined event that would be based in that country, and then they had some roll-ups. So the winner of the USA one, the winner of all the different national ones rolled up into a program that they had developed. And it was the theme of it was COVID solutions, right? And this was between the lockdown, which started mid-March, and I think the last of those events was by the end of April. So I mean, it was within a month that most of the events had happened. And so Stephen had sent out an email to maybe 50 people and called for a meeting vaguely like this on the Monday after the lockdowns. And I think there were probably 25 or 30 people on the meeting, and we held another meeting the next day and sort of picked up our own momentum. And they didn't have a lot of, they didn't have a playbook, right? I mean, it was only 4 days into this idea. And so they were working on an official playbook of how to go about this. We were building our own based on the community that had kind of continued working on this. And we went from within, I think we had about 2 weeks to launch our event, maybe 3. I forget the details, but we ended up with about 25 organizers. We had about 900 registrations, almost 1,000, I think. We were across from Alaska, maybe actually Hawaii, and around the world really. But we had 100 project ideas at the beginning of the weekend and final 50 teams by the end of the weekend. And we had to run 2 different Discord servers. We had to deal with 2 different time zones. I mean, it was a complex and crazy undertaking in a short period of time. And it galvanized the team of our organizing team, gave us a sense that we would love to do this more going forward. And just a lot of interesting insights and experiences came from it. Very minute details that I won't get into, but big picture stuff like the fact that we were able to create a true connectivity and that I had always argued that the difference between Phoenix and Tucson is about 100 miles, and you can't really have a startup, an ecosystem at a statewide level. I had made that point for a decade because you need people who are coming immersively into connections regularly for any sense of community to build. And now with the online experience, I think that's not true anymore, right? And so this is an experiment in what does it mean to build a community online as part of an online ecosystem. And it might be ambitious, it might be unrealistic to have the same sorts of expectations that you might be able to accomplish locally in person, but that's I think part of the vision and the experiment of all of this. So that's the background. We then spent, I would say, the rest of 2020 doing other initiatives and activities in parallel. Our group kind of stayed together and continued doing things. And then we really started thinking about this through the course of 2021. What would we want to do? And we collectively kind of put together a bunch of learning. And then over the course of this year, we picked a date and decided how we wanted to approach it. We actually picked the no code theme, and we'll kind of get into a little bit of the background of that in a minute. But the idea is that's a particularly novel and interesting addition to the startup contribution in terms of capacity building. It's one of the things I've observed in my local community is that there are so many people with ideas and no capacity to execute on them, that the no code movement is designed to supplement that and really allow someone without a technical background to really be able to build prototypes themselves. And so we decided as part of this upcoming launch that we would launch with the no code theme. And candidly, given some of the assumptions and feedback we've gotten, very likely no code will probably become part of the general purpose startup weekend model. Is how do you incorporate no code capabilities into it? So we're experimenting not only in terms of how to run another online startup weekend, but how to do it with the mission of keeping people connected into a community beyond the scope of the event, and how to plug people into doing all the things you would do in your local community. How do you hand them off to the next phase of development as part of what you're doing? How do you have connective conversations between organizations? How do you do outreach and develop capacity in underserved parts of your local market or your national market? So we've got some goals that I think were included in the email, but just kind of reiterate them a little bit. We want to catalyze a national online ecosystem and start to give dimension or definition to what that means, to Debbie's point initially. And then one of the objectives I think that's really important is to connect diverse startup founders, organizers, and domain experts. By that, I mean, there are geographic diversity. I think that's maybe the most obvious potential, is that we're now neighbors virtually with people all over the country and all over the world. How do we help connect maybe under resourced communities when it comes to maturity or density or capacity in smaller towns and smaller startup, less mature startup communities? How do we connect them with higher potential, more mature, deeper skilled, more experienced people from around the country? And that can happen in a couple of ways. One, just geographic connections. Another one can be that we start to identify niches where your local town might have a pretty robust, it might have the capacity to run a startup weekend all on its own on a regular basis actively, but it doesn't have a lot of depth in maybe emerging spaces like, so no code is an emerging space, but also I would say AI or space or certain aspects of digital health that you may have a personal experience or interest, but your community just doesn't have anybody else for you to connect with. Web3 or crypto is another example of that, right? So there's the geographic potential to be able to serve. There's also the community dimension, which is rural versus urban or other underserved population demographics, whether it's ethnicity or gender, right? There's different kinds of, when we say diverse, I think that there's the uniquely virtual dimension of geography, and then there's all the other ones that we might initially think about. So so how do we connect the founders and organizers, domain experts, ecosystem builders from across the country? The next is, how do we empower those smaller communities? So I think by aggregating these, Stephen at the time, for about a year after we ran the event, was still working at Techstars at the time. and they weren't seeing a lot of organizers running startup weekends. And I think from my sense of it, that a lot of that is that people were reluctant. There's the obvious answer of why wasn't that happening, which is that there's not a, people are burned out on sitting in meetings, several months after the lockdown. But I don't think that's entirely it. I think there's a lot of community that is deeply ingrained in doing what we're doing right now. So I don't really think that was the challenge. I think the bigger challenge was that organizers, if you try and organize an event in your local community in Tucson, I think that I would, with all the experience and time I put into building out capacity in Tucson, I think I would fail to run a successful startup weekend in Tucson because I don't know that there's enough self-identifying participation, and the anxiety over whether my event is going to fail, whether we're going to end up with 8 to 12 people at the end of the weekend. I need a much larger pool to get started so that it feels thorough and robust and a high quality experience by the end. And there's a high risk that any local organizer of an online local event won't be able to pull that off. What's interesting about a collective one like this is that we can leverage the technology and the capacity of many flyover communities to pull off 100 or 200 people and have a very high quality experience in a way that gives a lot of people access to new disciplines or new connections they might be able to make in other parts of the world that they wouldn't make today or a couple of years ago. But that also means that very small communities that maybe never could even pull off a startup weekend now have a place to connect into. So when I say rural, I'm also talking about those kinds of smaller areas. And then this is the one that I think we'll talk a little bit about. I think this is the one where I would say we have the least amount of capacity and probably the best opportunity to collaborate with other organizations, to Debbie's point, which is in the professional development space. The reason that this is on here and a primary focus is also it's one of the primary outcomes that I want to emphasize in our meeting today, and the call to action at the end is going to be around this. And so it's really about how you execute an online event of this kind of potential scale, that it's very easy to lose track of all the activity. The scale of it can become very big. And so we needed a lot of facilitators. And what we realized is that there's also another potential role by organizing this, which is to develop what, I would say there's within the startup weekend world, there's a mentor, and they are someone with, sort of proven experience that's scheduled to come in and be available for office hours a couple times over the weekend. Then there's the facilitator whose job it is to conduct the weekend with the help of the organizing team. What we've kind of identified as a role called a guide, and that the guide is really focused on lean startup education inside of the weekend. So that's sort of their specialty. And we've done this with a couple of prior events over the last couple of years and really liked the model and framework of it. So we're bringing it into this, which is that we want to recruit, I would say 40 volunteers for the upcoming weekend. And they become embedded guides. And by that, I mean that they go further than a coach or a facilitator would, which is sort of hands-off and asking questions. They kind of embed themselves into the team for the weekend. And their role isn't to execute with the team, it's to be the guide along with the team as they move through the weekend. And so that role, we're giving it a different name because it's a different level of commitment, a different responsibility. And we're also putting together a training weekend, a couple of these like workshops to prepare people for it. And then Stephen is going to lead as the train the trainer kind of a framework, the Q&A and feedback and facilitating the guides through the weekend. So what'll happen is there'll be some initial training around how to be an effective lean startup coach inside of an experience like Startup Weekend. Then the participants will have the opportunity to get some training and then apply the experience to the weekend and then get real-time feedback during the weekend on how to improve that. And the goal would be that that's hopefully a professional development capacity for our community's professionals that exists in some ways, in some places, but I think this will be quick and easy and inexpensive, and also helps facilitate the experience of the weekend at scale. And so that's what we mean by building professional ecosystem development capacity. So thinking of that, that's it's one of the, is anybody willing to help with that? One of the calls to action at the end. And then I would say, again, in the larger framework that Debbie identified earlier, which is there are other partners out there. This is one where I think we can build from this into some interesting and more expansive creative ideas going forward around professional development and how it leverages either the startup weekend or other activities that we might be doing as part of a broader intentional community online. So hopefully that helps. I'm going to pause really quick and open it up to questions in case there's any clarification that would be important right now. Anybody have any questions or thoughts?
I mean, there's a lot of thoughts right now rolling in the chat over there, but the biggest
sorry,
thing for
I'm
me-
navigating everything myself, so I'm not reading the chat. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. And so there's a lot of things happening over there too, but I know for me as like a rural ecosystem builder, like all of our startup weekends are between 8 and 28 people. Like our one tomorrow is 20 people. And it's really, really good for them. And that's what we need for a rural region because of the density and how things work like that. But 3 of those entrepreneurs from the last startup weekend are now in our accelerator. And so we figured out like, oh, this is a pipeline thing that's working for us. And so when we try to push an entrepreneur, specifically from our region, into something national, they feel so small and unseen on that stage that they then don't participate again. And then they especially don't want to participate with us on a local level because of how intimidating that process was. So even if you have a ton of people in the room, if they don't have the local rep there being like, no, you're doing great, like we're here with you, we're here beside you, that hand-to-hand touch that you need with so many entrepreneurs is completely lost in an online setting, no matter how many times you try to recreate it. So I like the focus on what I think, yeah, CJ just said it, putting so much focus on this and like really trying to drive home, especially I like the no code side because that is really big for a rural region. We don't have as many technical founders here. We'd love to help develop them and things like that. But the biggest thing for me when I'm looking at something like this is I buy into what you were saying a lot earlier, what you used to preach of like ecosystem building for me is bottom up specific to my region's needs. So it's really hard for me to force any of my entrepreneurs or tell any of my entrepreneurs to enter a national online space when they can't compete in a national online space yet.
Continue, Mary.
Yeah, I'm 100% with Debbie. I work in a lot of rural communities. The largest portion of my service area is rural. And we have a startup thing here and in Springfield, Missouri, and you just don't get anyone from the rural communities that will even come into Springfield to do a tech startup because it's just not what the judges want to see. You know, it's completely different. It's 100% different. So I feel like with something like this, it's like you have to have a rural startup weekend and then like a tech startup, a urban or a suburban. I mean, because it is so regionally based. You look in a rural area and those startups are not tech based at all. And I work with startups every day. And I can tell you from the startups that I've got funded over the last 4 years, out of 100, maybe 2 of them, maybe 1 are tech-based, maybe are something that a startup weekend, a pitch would actually fund. The majority of them are just not, you know, I mean, they're just, it's very, very different. So I'm wondering, I'm with Debbie, like, I'm wondering how you guys would make this something that smaller communities would want to be involved in, how it could be viable, where, like, what kind of startups are you looking for? I get bakeries, I get people who are farming. I get people who are manufacturing, agricultural, I mean, or crafting, I mean, like there's such a wide variety of startups.
So I think this is why I wanted to have more of these conversations, because this is not a perspective that was shared last week. And I got to say that my own viewpoint was that geography is the barrier. I do understand, even in Tucson, we have tech and we have a lot of not tech, right? So Tucson includes, I would say, a lot of rural. The profile that you just described, I think I'm familiar with it from our own community. And so, I look at it, so I love hearing this because it's challenging the fundamental understanding that the value proposition of serving rural, as I make that sort of claim in the slides, you're challenging that. I love it. And so a couple of thoughts here. One is that the idea of getting lost, that's true even in a larger, I mean, that's true for all kinds of startup weekends. The facilitator's job, hopefully organize in an in-person one, is to make sure that no matter what's happening, the people that are there feel like they're not left out, right? So I mean, I think that's a critical first step, is that there's someone who's in the room physically doing that. That role gets harder when you get larger numbers of people. That's why that's exactly why we established the idea of an embedded team member. We recognize that it's also hard to read the room virtually. Like, you can't sit and give polling all day long for 54 hours straight. And you're also not sitting in a room with the noise and energy and buzz to get a visceral sense of how the room is going. So we wanted more people on the team to be intimately connected with the participants. And the idea is that for every 5 people, there's going to be 1 volunteer who's embedded in that team through the experience. And I think to your question of like, how would I be able to trust that my people are being well cared for? I would say that we want to make sure we hit the right ratio in terms of the number of those people, and that someone who's an advocate as intimately as you're describing, which is sort of wonderful to hear. I don't know that that's always, that intimacy isn't always the case that you're offering. I would take it as a challenge that we make sure that for those that are willing to go to that level, we connect them in with members of their community, so that the whoever that embedded guide is knows who the liaisons are by geography or by community, whoever the nominating sort of Sherpa is for this batch of people in your local community, that we have a genuine connectivity there, right? That you're serving as a team to help move people through the experience. It doesn't mean, I will say that it probably doesn't mean that for sure no code is not going to be, no code is probably easier than find a co-founder and go build a high-tech Silicon Valley investable startup. It's also going to be still, it's not the most everyday business. It's got its own technical limitations as well, right? And so I would say the themes that we're starting with no code, but the intention is we would do more of these. I wrote down that we should do a rural theme. Like, as soon as you said that jumped out at me as it would be a catalyst for learning more about how to do this well with the audience we think is one of the top capable of serving communities. It would be an experiment to see how we might attract people to a no code version. It would be a separate and equally interesting experiment to see how we would be able to put together an intentional event around rural needs. And I think we would absolutely, that jumps high on my list of next topics and themes because it's so valuable for learning and doesn't really exist, right? So I love that.
And Justin, can I add another thing to your
Sure.
topics of high needs? I mean, typically when investors are looking at startups and investing, they're looking at high return. When you look at rural communities, there's not that in 3 months, we're going to be able to pay back $300,000, $500,000. So adding in a component for investors that looks at lower costs, so maybe different tiers of, I want to invest $10,000, I want to invest $25,000, I want to invest 50,000, all the way up to $500,000. Like if there's those different tiers, so those smaller businesses, because a lot of those businesses in rural communities, they don't need $500,000, and they're not going to be able to pay that back ever. So looking at different tiers of funding needs, so maybe a 50,000 to 150,000, you know, with a 6-month return, having those different modes available that would be more regionally appropriate. I think that I would be, when I look at referring my clients to something like that, I'm not going to send them to something that asks them to send it back. You know, they have to pay it back in 3 months, because that's just not feasible. So, and they don't need $500,000, or they don't need $250,000. So looking at maybe those different tiers, rural, and that's urban too. I work with a lot of urban clients that don't need that. So maybe having that as the classification versus rural and urban. I don't know what other people think on that, but like the clients that I'm working with definitely are more based on amount, as well as, you know, just their location.
So I want to add one thing that I didn't include in my preparation, or even exactly in the commentary last week, but I think would be really helpful for seeing the vision that that gets me excited. So what I'm hearing is all these are the perfect kinds of comments. They're critiques, but they're not attacks, right? They are, where are the gaps? You're searching for those gaps, which is, I thrive on that. So please keep critiques coming, more than praise. Here's a way to think about the opportunity I think we have, that you can't really do in a local community. Think of this as Startup Weekend as a service, which is to say that we could do, conceptually, we could do one very large event, and within that event have multiple themes or verticals. And the way that we would engage community partners would be based on their passion for the vertical and their connections into, and that vertical could then offer its own prizes. It could recruit its own sphere of mentors. It could have its own sort of network of sponsors or partners that funnel in other, you know, eyeballs and participants, or domain experts in those areas. And then, you know, if you're thinking of it from the rural small community perspective, that particular vertical could provide access to world-class talent that a local in-person event could never do, unlikely to be able to do. And that the framework we're talking about can be a way to make it easy to do that across communities, right? That we're providing the back office infrastructure, the training, the systems, the tools, and the catalyst, I would say, in addition to all those other things. And so when I used that term a while back, and then I stopped using it, but I think it might be helpful in this moment to think of this as a soft Startup Weekend or ecosystem as a service framework. I wouldn't call it exactly a technology platform, but a framework, an opportunity. And hopefully, does that resonate as something that might be useful? Because then we could, you know, bring in organizers across multiple verticals who have that capacity to organize it and to connect in different audiences from across the country. Good. Okay. I also saw, I was trying to read through the comments and listen at the same time. And I think one of the comments that I saw CJ made that got kind of high five from somebody else was that there are a lot of other roles besides, and I'm trying to remember the wording he used, certain besides the entrepreneurs and the organizers, there are different kinds of participants in the organizing of an ecosystem, and they don't have time to commit for a whole weekend. And that a weekend, so I wanted to say a couple things. One, totally agree with that. In fact, there's this interesting flaw that I see in startup weekends, which is in general, there's really two big flaws. And I told this to Mark Nagar a while back, and I was surprised to hear him agree with me. One of the early founders of the nonprofit Startup Weekend before they merged with Techstars. The first problem I saw, two major ones. First problem I saw was that everybody who comes into Startup Weekend who has an idea but isn't in a position to be persuasive about it within an hour of showing up ends up being told no because they don't do it. They're not well trained and ready for that early moment. And then they disappear because they're very passionate about that idea and they don't get to work on it, which is why they came. And I saw that so often. And so I challenged myself in the local community to create a framework for Startup Weekend that allowed everybody who came in to work on their idea and also gave them at least one person to work with so that they weren't alone. And that's how we came up with the idea of this guide, an embedded professional partner who was there to support them, who knew the lean startup experience and could be a guide for them to go through it. The model that we're talking about, that was the origin of it, was getting people who would otherwise drop out because they're too passionate and yet they're too early to not quit. And so I think that's useful to appreciate that backstory. The other is that there are so many people in an ecosystem in a local community who as you do this over the years, you find all of their skills. And you start to realize that all participants of all of your past Startup Weekends are domain experts in some way or another. They are really valuable assets. And so we built a platform to do online Startup Weekends. And in it, we included a directory. And I sent out an invite to my network when we first did this in Arizona and invited, I think, 250 what I'm calling domain experts or mentors in Arizona to be part of this. And the ask of them was that they might get a phone call and they might have to give 15 minutes during the weekend. And they had no larger commitment than that obligated to them. And what that did is it turned the small pool of like 10 mentors who were available for office hours at discrete times during the event into a directory of people who were willing to take a phone call from a team during the event. And then we made that directory searchable by their skill set, by the region, it was basically a LinkedIn for the online Startup Weekend event. And so one of the things that we see as an opportunity is to bring that platform forward into another event. And then what you end up with is people opting into an event that they may or may, odds are they're not going to get called because there's far more people than there are teams in the directory, but that becomes a really powerful resource for the participants to be able to filter and search and find domain experts or professional or geographic people that can help unlock customer interviews or whatever it might be, right? Your initial like debrief. And so I think for CJ's benefit, we have actually kind of worked out a pathway to make that a stronger piece of the process. So we are at the end of our hour. So I want to respect the fact that we've kind of run over. What I want to make sure before people disappear is that, and I'll send a follow-up email around this, is that we have two roles that we're really asking people to consider whether they're willing and interested in participating in. And we've kind of talked around both of them. One is as a guide through the weekend. And thank you, Cecilia, for sharing that I should stick with that terminology. So being a guide, so it's sort of like a participant through the course of the weekend. Would love we need to get probably 30 to 40 of those volunteers identified. It could be one of you, it could be someone who you know from your community that you think would be really good at becoming a startup coach, or they are a domain expert, or they're an entrepreneur, but they've never learned the lean startup methodology. Therefore, they're out there kind of giving the wrong kind of advice early on. This is a training pathway for people who aren't necessarily great at advising early stage entrepreneurs, but would be great if given this sort of background. So we were looking for 40 of those. And the reason that's in terms of our timeline, our highest priority is that when we know we have all 40, we can unlock our maximum headcount of 200 tickets. It becomes a bottleneck if we need one of those for every team, and we only have 10 of them, then we need to limit it to 10 teams, which puts you at more like 50, right? So we want to make sure we have as many of those people willing to play that role identified as soon as possible. So my ask is, if any of you are interested in that or willing to volunteer, I'm going to send I don't have a list available today, but I'm going to send out an individual email to everybody with here's how I can help, kind of a form to fill out. So I'd love for you to keep an eye out for that. The other role is not only as the more of the community and regional lead, right? So this is where I'm taking inspiration in some ways from Global Entrepreneurship Week, is that they identified community partners in regions, one per state or a couple per state or per city. I think that framework is a model that is important. And to the degree that Cecilia, as staff member, to the degree that we might be able to find an opportunity to collaborate with the existing people doing that, I think that would be spectacular. But in the absence of a collaboration opportunity, assembling who would be sort of regional champions in your local community or in your state. So the second volunteer would be, how do we make sure we are not excluding many different types of communities that are not that are often not the first in line for these kinds of opportunities? How do we make sure that we have infrastructure in place to do the best job we can with the first event, and that we then grow that over time into more and more deeper and deeper trusted connections into the underrepresented communities? So those are the two, I think, major opportunities. And then I would say I've heard a lot of interesting ideas, and the purpose of this is that it's an exploration, not just an event with a plan and we're asking for your free time to make this happen. It's also, I think, a platform that interesting and creative ideas like a rural themed event or other opportunities might emerge. So I would also add, I'm happy to do one-on-one meetings. If you want to take a deeper dive into some ideas you have, I would be happy to. We're going to do a couple more of these. I'll probably put a schedule of multiple in place. And we're going to then also have a schedule of the trainings for the guides. So we'll put that out as well. So I think I'm going to end with that. I'm happy to stick around and continue a conversation, but I also recognize we're now a few minutes past the end of our official start time. I also noticed there's tons of notes in here that I missed. So I'm sure that I've missed a lot of your thoughts. So I'll stick around and just listen for anybody who wants to unmute and continue the conversation.